Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the European Union. Is it time to reform or to break up? Growth's disappearing, job losses are rising. In France, they're introducing more austerity. As the times get tough, we speak to the author of the book, The Trouble with Europe. Also this week, recession in Russia. The IMF warns Putin's Crimea grab is bad for the economy, while Ukraine gets $17 billion to plug a hole in its economy. And Pakistan's automotive industry, but not your average people carriers. We look at the demand for armoured cars amongst Karachi's more affluent. Hello again, everyone. Nice to be back with you this week, and thanks to Stephen Cole for filling in last week. Today we're back to one of our old favourite topics, Europe, and an in-depth look at where the continent, the currency and the zone are all headed. Because there's a theory that the crisis is actually over, or at least heading that way. No one's talking about countries exiting, bailouts are being wound down. Even Greece, the poster child of European debt, has returned to the bond markets and recorded a primary budget surplus. But do we believe the hype? Our guest this week is Roger Bootle, author of the book The Trouble with Europe, and we're going to sit down for an in-depth chat with him in a moment. But first this, a reminder that austerity is still alive and kicking, in this case in France. Here's Jackie Rowland with more.
The French government aims to bring its budget deficit down to the Europe-wide target of 3% next year, which is optimistic given that the deficit currently stands at 4.3%. The Prime Minister, who's been in the job less than a month, has now gone into detail.
For almost 40 years, France has spent more than it has made. And we all know that when we live beyond our means, we can't envisage the future with serenity. Everyone knows this. The French have understood this for a long time. We have lost faith in our country.
The budget savings break down like this. The central state budget will be cut by $25 billion. Local authorities' spending will be cut by $15 billion. Social Security will also see $15 billion cut from its budget, and healthcare spending will be reduced by $14 billion. The government plans to make those healthcare savings by reducing the number of operations, using more generic drugs, and reducing the time a patient stays in hospital.
To complicate matters, the French President François Hollande has promised to cut taxes on business in an attempt to encourage job creation. So the government is caught between cutting taxes on one hand and cutting the deficit on the other. It's hard to see how it can deliver on both. The unions are firmly against any policy changes which they fear would undermine France's welfare state. For example, plans to freeze some pensions and benefit payments. The Prime Minister is trying hard to avoid the word austerity. France's European partners are already going through austerity. In 2010, Germany announced $110 billion in budget cuts over 5 years and pledged to balance the books by 2015. And in the same year, the UK promised $140 billion in budget cuts, aiming to balance its books by 2015. So why has France finally decided to go down this path?
Everyone else, on average, has got their deficit down, and even the countries that really struggled during the crisis are on the right track. And France is the outlier. It becomes the country that hasn't done enough.
Manuel Valls is under pressure from the left wing of his own party, which says it wasn't elected to impoverish millions of families. He's also under criticism from the opposition, which accuses him of having no new ideas. France delayed taking the painful medicine, but it may be out of time.
So France, the powerhouse, has got its problems, but we also mentioned Greece before, and I'd like to spend a moment on that just before we speak to our guest. Greece was a mess, we all know that, but it took the bailout, it stopped a complete meltdown, and as we said before, has now returned to the bond markets with some success. But it's also about how you want to define success. Greece now appears to have the income to cover its spending. But that's only if, and it's a big if you ignore the interest it has to pay on its debt and you ignore the bailout for its banks. And it's pretty hard to call that a success, because really, how do you just ignore such major ongoing debt factors? So, has the European Union survived? Has it proved what it's capable of, or in fact shown that it's really past its usefulness? Our guest certainly thinks the EU needs some fundamental reform. He is economist Roger Bootle, the author of the book The Trouble with Europe. Welcome to Counting the Cost. How are you, Roger?
I'm fine, thank you very much.
Let's start with that very simple title you have, The Trouble with Europe. If I met you at a dinner party or at a function or something, I said to you, Roger, what is the trouble with Europe? What would you say to me?
Well, I'd say that the trouble has begun right at the start, as it usually does. That's to say, with the objective of pursuing ever closer union, which is what's written into the Treaty of Rome, which set up the whole thing in 1957. And the pursuit of ever closer union among a group of countries, a large group of countries, which are completely different, with different histories, different characteristics and so on, that pursuit is bound to require increasing regulation, interference, as the centre tries to shoehorn these very different countries into some sort of artificial commonality.
So the whole idea was flawed because, well, I mean, one of the basic ideas is the fact that this union should have brought the periphery countries up and helped them along and made them part of a stronger bloc. But in fact, certainly at the start of this economic crisis, they were the ones dragging the whole bloc down.
Well, let's draw a distinction between the EU and the euro. If we go back to the beginning of the EU, of course the euro wasn't around, and I think there's a sense in which the EU probably did achieve quite a lot, and certainly in preparing to join it and then subsequently enjoying access to its markets, a number of less developed countries on Europe's fringe did enjoy for a long time some rapid rates of economic growth. And let's face it, also the EU performed a useful role in drawing in, acting as a receiving house, as I like to put it, for the refugee countries from the former Eastern Bloc. So all that was pretty good. Then we come on to the euro. Well, the euro, of course, in my view, was completely flawed from the start, and you're absolutely right. What's happened is that the peripheral countries, for them, the euro has been a complete and utter disaster.
Well, not just for them, but for everyone else as well. All that confidence which waned in the eurozone just recently. If you widen out beyond the crisis, would you say the eurozone? Yeah, let's talk about the eurozone. That growth has actually been disappointing over those last, let's say, 2 decades or so.
Oh, there's no doubt that the eurozone has been a distinct underperformer compared to, well, almost any metric you care to choose. And compared to the UK, for instance, never mind the US or the emerging markets of the world, there's this great illusion in much of Europe that somehow or other, isn't it wonderful that we've got this marvellous grouping which has delivered so many wonderful things for us. Well, in fact, it hasn't. The economic record is pretty clear. For a long time now, actually even before the euro was formed, the countries of the EU have been underperformers.
And has it played a role in the problems we see with, let's talk about unemployment for a start, because that's been a huge factor in more recent years of this crisis, the jobs crisis, which doesn't seem to really improve. Has that, again, been a contributing factor?
Oh, there's no doubt that the euro has played, I think, a very big role in these high levels of unemployment you see in many European countries, because without the euro, what would have happened is that those countries no doubt would have undergone some form of currency weakness that would have made their economies more competitive. You wouldn't have had the terrific pressure that you have had to cut jobs. But that's not the only thing at work. I mean, after all, if you look at the disparity in unemployment rates across Europe, it's quite striking. You've got Germany with very low rates, France at around about 10%, and you've got Spain and Greece running at around about 25% of the workforce. Now that tells you there must be something else going on, and indeed there is, that in some of these countries, excuse me, the barriers to employment are really very strong. This is primarily not about aggregate demand, it's primarily about regulation.
Okay, tell me more about barriers to employment then, because if you're going to grow economies and make people happy again and improve their livelihoods, then jobs is what have to be created. What are these barriers? Tell me more about that.
Well, you know, companies have, when they experience increased demand for their output, to increase employment, they've got to feel obviously that's going to be profitable. They don't want to be told by the government that you've got to employ so many people of so many type that they can't work more than so many hours, that you've got to track all that. And when you come across an employee who isn't very good, you can't get rid of him without paying him 10 years' money or whatever, or you're going to have a strike on your hands. I mean, across many parts of Europe, employers are scared of taking on new labour because they're worried about what the consequences will be for their profitability. Now, that's not a healthy position to be in. What you want is an economy where employers surely don't fear that at all, and so whenever they get an increase in demand, they readily take on more labour. Now, that traditionally, of course, has been the picture in America. It's become more like the picture actually in the UK, where employment has been growing really very strongly indeed, even though until recently the economy hasn't been that strong.
Okay, so I'm getting two pictures from you as we have this discussion. One is about obviously economic problems across countries, but then also you've described regulation and things which affect businesses like that. Let's look at those two issues separately in the, or through the prism, if you like, of trying to fix these problems. Regulation, changing it. I mean, the whole thing with the EU, any bloc, is that power gets taken away from governments and gets centralised, in this case, to Brussels. Is that when you're talking about reform? Is that when you're talking about the change in regulation reform?
Yes, I think a lot has to be done here. Essentially, powers have to come back from the centre, from Brussels, to the individual nation states of Europe. There has to be, I think, a change in the position and power of the European Court of Justice, so that all sorts of complainants can't get national rulings overruled at that level. I mean, there are a number of regulations emanating at the European level which have been really very dangerous and harmful. The Working Time Directive is, I think, perhaps the worst of those, which is actually limiting the amount of time that someone can put into doing their job. But one thing needs to be stressed: not everything that's wrong in European countries today is the fault of the European Union. A lot of this interference in labour markets comes actually as the result of actions by national governments. It's not laid down by the EU. Some of it is, but a lot of it isn't. And that's where those countries themselves have got to look to their own laws and try to put them right.
Here's the thing though, Roger, if you decentralise in the way you're talking about, then is there any point in actually having a European Union?
Well, not a European Union of the sort we've got now. No, I mean, I don't believe that's at all useful. What actually we need is not some attempt to form a European superstate with all the trappings that that brings along, but rather some loose framework of association, I think, a framework of friendship that brings open trade, that may well have a foreign policy and defence aspect, certainly ought to have an environmental aspect, but which actually leaves the member countries fully independent to do whatever they want in the way that they think is best. And what's more, leaves them to compete with one another. So this is one of the, I think, really bad things that's happened as a result of the EU. It's sort of put a comfort blanket over the whole continent, so that the policymakers think they know the direction in which things are going, that's to say along the lines of the European social model. They don't feel, each country, that they've got to do their very best in order to, as it were, win the competitive race against the next country. If they did feel that, I think you'd find that governments would very much act to rescind a lot of these very damaging laws.
Okay, so we've talked about possible regulatory changes there. Tell me about economic changes. You would have heard our report before, France introducing a fifth round of austerity. I mean, at this point, 2014, after this crisis began 5 or 6 years ago, is that the way to still be going?
Well, there's a serious issue here, because what's in the interest of the public finances isn't necessarily in the interests of the economy. And I think you can easily get misled, not least by the media and the financial markets, into thinking they're the same, or if they aren't the same, what's all important to the public finances. Now, I don't think that's true. Now, the public finances are, of course, in a mess in a number of countries, including France, and something's got to be done about them. But if that's all you do, if you just cut, then you risk sending the economy into some sort of recession. And the European economy, although it's been recovering, it's still, frankly, pretty weak. And I think the countries like France have got to be careful in what they do. Now, the big problem here, in my view, is Germany. And it's a problem because it's not spending enough. What actually European policymakers need to do, yes, perhaps France has got to cut back its spending for all the reasons that your report talked about, but Germany simultaneously has got to be spending more. And if you get both those things together, then you can adjust the budget while not actually clobbering the economy.
Just a quick word, you mentioned Germany. I just wanted to go back to France, and this is kind of a hypothetical, but would a country like France, which is cutting back and putting in more austerity, or a Greece, or this, those types of countries, would they actually be better off outside of the euro now for themselves and for the eurozone itself?
Well, France is an interesting case. Let's talk first of all about Greece. I think Greece would be better off outside the euro. So would Italy. I'm quite sure that Italy outside the euro would undergo a significant currency depreciation, and I'd be quite confident that within about 18 months you'd see Italy booming again. Exports would pick up and the economy would do pretty well. Now, France is an intermediate case. Excuse me. She likes to think of herself as very similar to Germany, but increasingly over the last several years she's looked more similar to Spain and Italy. I think that France probably would be better off outside the euro, letting her currency weaken and again enjoy stronger economic growth. But of course this is just such a major political blow, a cost or loss to bear for the French establishment, and for the last 60, 70 years a central part of what they've been aiming at has been the relationship with Germany and together building this common Europe. So for France to leave the euro, well, that really is big stuff.
Roger Bootle, talking about the trouble with Europe. That's the name of his book as well. It has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time today. Now, these days, Russia is a big factor in Europe, what with the Ukraine-Crimea crisis, and of course the fact that Russia supplies about 30% of Europe's gas needs. But you know something, Russia's got problems of its own right now. It was widely thought Russia would come close to recession later this year, but the International Monetary Fund says Russia's already there, thanks largely to sanctions and tens of billions of dollars leaving the country. Nadim Baba looks now at the political reaction.
A bad week for the Russian economy has just got worse. The International Monetary Fund now says the country is in recession, cutting its growth forecast for 2014 from 1.3% to just 0.2%. And it's saying the reaction to Russia's involvement in Ukraine is largely to blame.
The difficult situation, and especially the uncertainty surrounding the geopolitical situation and follow-up on sanctions and escalation on sanctions, are weighing very negatively on investor climate.
The European Union and United States have just added new names to their lists of people, and in America's case, companies, subject to sanctions. They've cited President Putin's failure to rein in pro-Russia separatists in eastern Ukraine. And the Ukraine crisis has already hit Russia's economy through capital flight. Russia's central bank says investors moved around $64 billion out of the country between January and March. The IMF now predicts the total figure for this year could be $100 billion.
But although the latest IMF announcements seem like bad news for Russia, some people here are actually suggesting that the figures could be a blessing in disguise.
Some politicians say the crisis could spur Russia to seek new partners in economies like China.
It is positive for Russia because until today Russia's full potential has not been realised, with business focusing mainly on the West. I think that both Western and US businesses will experience more adverse effects because of the imposed sanctions.
And on the streets of the capital, many were defiant.
There is a proverb that says, "What doesn't kill us makes us stronger." Whatever obstacles are being created on our way, we will overcome them all the same.
And the IMF says inflation could reach 6% here this year. That's something that will hit ordinary Russians, whatever happens over the border in Ukraine.
Now, how do you measure confidence in an economy? And more to the point, how do you judge if business feels the global economy has finally turned the corner? Well, a crucial measure is mergers and acquisitions, and so far this year the total has hit $1 trillion, the fastest pace since 2007. We're going to focus on drugs company mergers because there is a lot of activity there. Valeant, for one, which has launched a $45 billion bid for the maker of Botox, Allergan. Then you've got these two, GlaxoSmithKline and Novartis, who are looking at an asset swap worth about $20 billion. And then the big one, Pfizer, which is looking at a $106 billion deal for the UK's AstraZeneca. Now, with Pfizer, there are two issues. One is job cuts. With all the takeovers, Pfizer's slashed more than 56,000 jobs worldwide, according to the Wall Street Journal. The other, though, is tax. Put simply, Pfizer is moving its headquarters to the UK because corporate tax there is 20%, as opposed to the 35% in the United States. David Schuster from Al Jazeera America spoke to David K. Johnston about that issue. He's a tax analyst, author and journalist.
Oh, I think it's pretty offensive to the United States. You know, back when the Twin Towers were still burning in New York, one of the big four accounting firms was advising clients, and I got a copy of the video and wrote about it back then, that patriotism should take a back seat to profits. And they were proposing back then a similar deal using a Bermuda mailbox. If you're going to take all the benefits of the United States market and the benefits taxpayers have provided to you as a company, from infrastructure and research to educated employees, I think this is pretty offensive conduct.
How much money has the U.S. Treasury lost in terms of revenue that they could have otherwise gotten from companies that went overseas to lower their tax rate?
Well, we're overall for all companies, we're talking tens of billions of dollars. The trick, David, is to earn your profits in the highest tax jurisdiction you can and then use accounting devices to funnel the money out of the country. One of the ways Pfizer does it is that the intellectual property rights, the patents, and the how to make rules for Viagra are all in an offshore tax haven. So every time they sell one of those little blue diamond pills, the profits that are really earned from that are siphoned out of the United States and they're not taxed.
Why won't Congress do something about it? I mean, what's so difficult politically about fixing this?
Well, from the outside, it's easy to say they should fix it. From the inside, the reality is that members of Congress, if they want to get reelected, cannot incur the wrath of big multinational companies who spend a fortune on lobbying. There are probably 100,000 people across the country employed to influence government on behalf of big corporations. And if you don't play ball with them, they'll find somebody who will, and they'll get you voted out of office. I mean, there's even an organization, the Club for Growth, that specifically targets those Republicans who don't toe the line on reducing taxes on the rich and eliminating taxes for corporations.
What about the argument from corporations to say, look, we're simply going the way any American would. We're following a strategy that will lower our tax bill, and the problem is not, well, the United States is taxing us at a higher rate than Great Britain, and so, hey, United States, lower the rate to 20%, and then we won't go to Great Britain.
Well, let me unpack that in two parts. The first one is, it's perfectly legal to do whatever the law allows. That doesn't mean that it's the appropriate thing to do, and corporations used to worry about reputation. They don't seem to do that anymore. The second part of it is it's Congress that makes the rules. Congress does not have to allow this kind of conduct. It doesn't have to say you can get a free ride, and that's what's really going on here. Pfizer, which gets massive subsidies from the taxpayers, wants a free ride, and other companies are sure to follow their strategy. And I think we should raise questions about why all of us are being taxed to benefit a company like Pfizer, and yet Pfizer does not want to bear any of the burden of supporting government that makes its profits possible.
And finally this week, cars in Pakistan. Not just cars, armoured cars. And not just armoured cars for the likes of politicians and VIPs, but for residents of the largest city, Karachi. MTS Tayyab picks up the story from there.
Making a vehicle bombed and bulletproof isn't easy. This 4x4 Jeep was first stripped to its frame. Mechanics will eventually insert thick metal plates into the door, install bulletproof windows, and then beef up the suspension to cope with the extra 1,000 kilograms of steel and glass that has been added. Armored vehicles are increasingly becoming a must-have for residents of Karachi. The city of 18 million people has a long history of violence, much of it associated with gangs linked to political parties. But in recent times, the Taliban has also grown in influence. Just last year, more than 2,000 people were killed in attacks, and around 100 were abducted for ransom.
The killings and kidnappings across Karachi show no signs of slowing, which is why those who can afford it are installing windows which can stop an AK-47 bullet and an internal frame which can resist a bomb attack.
Umar Jabran's family has been in the car manufacturing business for more than 20 years. But over the past year, he's seen a huge increase in the demand for armored vehicles. Initially, he had only 1 or 2 customers a month. Now he has at least a dozen at any given time.
Now I think that people have really become aware that such an investment is probably quite necessary, if especially one can afford it.
Armoring a car isn't cheap. The cost of making it bombed and bulletproof is anywhere from $30,000 to $40,000, and that's on top of the purchase of the vehicle. But it's a small price to pay for peace of mind, says Saeed Khan. Not his real name. He's asked us to hide his identity for security reasons. He had his Jeep armored a few months ago.
I was mugged like 4 times in the last 2.5 years. And, you know, a time comes when you feel enough is enough and, you know, you have to look for a solution.
But in a country where many people live on only a few dollars a day, it's a solution open to a privileged few.
And that is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com. You click through to the programs link, you'll find the Counting the Cost page there with all our previous episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch. You can tweet me at Kamal AJE. There's also our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, and don't forget to use the hashtag Counting the Cost with that. Or just email us. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.